This is Atlas Network with Michael Carnuccio.
Hi, and welcome to another episode of Atlas Network. I'm your host, Michael Carnuccio. Excited to have a conversation today, as we always do, about the worldwide freedom movement and the partners and the people involved there, about a leader that is on the forefront of new technology, new opportunity, and a new conversation about providing freedom and opportunity to all, and that's financial freedom. And that is Matt Pines with the Bitcoin Policy Institute. Matt, thanks so much for being with us today.
Thanks for having me.
Matt, I'm sure you get this question all the time, and so let's just get it out of the way and start there, right? When you say, hey, I'm with the Bitcoin Policy Institute, somebody often has to say, well, what is the Bitcoin Policy Institute? What do you all do? So how do you, in your words, answer that question?
Yes, we are a nonpartisan think tank for Bitcoin. So nonpartisan, right? Meaning we support both sides of the aisle. We want to advance this technology. We view Bitcoin fundamentally as a technology that helps advance a number of different objectives that we think are good for America and for the world. And so we have a certain ethos embedded in our vision for that technology. And we want to advocate for it, but principally we educate, right? So we provide academically vetted research and analysis from a whole cohort of economists, philosophers, energy experts, national security practitioners to help, Congress and national leadership kind of get their hands around a kind of a complex issue, right? That's relatively new on the scene inside DC. And so we want to be kind of the trusted advisor and sort of supporter for the folks that are really trying to push policy on digital assets and Bitcoin in particular in the next few years.
So I want to take that two different ways, right, as a follow-up, because there's a lot that you mentioned there that I'm sure our listeners and viewers are going to want to dive deeper on. But first, let's dive into your story, right? What brought you to becoming the executive director of the Bitcoin Policy Institute?
Yeah, my career has been a winding road. So I did undergraduate degrees in physics and philosophy at Johns Hopkins. Then I did a master's in philosophy and public policy at the London School of Economics. First, I was going to get a PhD in physics, did a hard right turn, stalled during the financial crisis to get a master's in London, came back to the States. I got a fellowship at the National Science Foundation for 2 years, and she's supporting the grant programs that they make across all the economics discipline, sort of behavioral economics, business school research, maybe getting a PhD in economics, decided to take a hard turn out of that, stumbled into national security consulting. So basically helping the government kind of think about worst case scenarios. So I did lots of war games and program assessments of emerging technology and kind of strategic foresight. So lots of like bad case scenarios, did a lot of classified work on those topics. And then became director of intelligence for a geopolitical and cybersecurity risk advisory shop around the same time that I more formally started talking about Bitcoin in public around COVID. I was always interested in these sorts of what if questions, like looking around the next 5, 10, 15 years. And for the government, helping them think about the convergence of technology, geopolitical risk, and general sort of social change, and thinking about this sort of low probability, high consequence scenarios. And when I was looking at Bitcoin in 2019, 2020, I realized like there's a plausible scenario where Bitcoin significantly monetizes and becomes a meaningful global asset and a global network. But I didn't see anyone in the government really taking that possibility seriously and doing the same sorts of like forward-looking analysis. So I wrote kind of this first white paper for BPI when they were basically just a glorified blog. Some guys, had this idea for a Bitcoin think tank, and they just DM'd me on Twitter because I was, writing Twitter threads on Bitcoin and national security to about 200 Twitter followers. And they said, hey, do you want to put that into a white paper? And I said, sure. And so that kind of launched me into the Bitcoin space, where I kind of had like a parallel career as like a Bitcoin national security guy. And so while I was doing my normal geopolitical risk and cyber security kind of consultancy work, I also kind of getting more and more brought into kind of the Bitcoin side of things. I kind of had a parallel track. And really it was until Donald Trump's election and then his appointment of relevant officials where, I made a strategic assessment of the landscape now for the next few years and realized that this administration was going to embark upon a pretty decisive shift in how the U.S. government has historically approached Bitcoin. And, the levers were sort of transient and very sort of asymmetric in the sense that if you can steer the ship of state in the right direction now, sort of the positive paths can be maximized and the negative paths can be minimized. And so I decided to kind of do the jump and join BPI as executive director, which is sort of a long time coming. And the organization has matured and has really become kind of a trusted voice inside DC, both on Capitol Hill and at the White House, as well as throughout different executive agencies. And I also like building, things like teams from scratch. The sort of small consultancy I was with was acquired by a publicly traded cybersecurity company. And, it seemed like this was the time to kind of go all in. And it seems like this is sort of the historical moment kind of coming to fruition here.
Yeah, fascinating background and inspiring, the storyline there. There's something you mentioned that I'm interested in understanding more. For someone that's focused on national security and threat assessment and everything else, what is it about Bitcoin that popped on your radar originally and got you interested to start diving in? How did that happen?
Well, everyone has like a few different exposures to Bitcoin, and usually the first time is usually when you dismiss it and then you regret that. So back in like 2014, I was kind of a nerd. I was paying attention to various things, and I had friends that were very into Bitcoin that then. And I was like taking the contra position. I was like, this thing is a pump and dump scam. This is just another tulip bulb, moment. Like, what's really going on here? I didn't really dig deep into it. I just sort of, I was dismissive of it. I came back to it. I mean, and then a few years later, I kind of bought some, but it was like I didn't really look too deeply into it, right? I started thinking more deeply about it in 2019 after I realized it wasn't dead. And then sort of the COVID year, like strategically shifted my overall view of the fundamental kind of structure of the global economic monetary system. And so I went down lots of different sort of, analytical rabbit holes to try to come up with a more synthetic view of how I see the global order evolving after it's facing like a pretty severe shock, right? And a lot of things that were latent in the system were now coming to the fore. And so I realized Bitcoin was now going to be a very important feature of the next 5, 10, 15 years. And I also was I was mostly doing, classified work for the government. So I wasn't like on Twitter, had no social media profile. So I decided to create like a social media profile with my name during COVID. Everyone, was doing various things to kind of keep themselves sane. And I just started tweeting about it, kind of thinking about these ideas in public. I wasn't sure if they were, coherent or not. But that just sort of was a trigger point for me to kind of pull together these separate threads, my traditional background, my sort of analytic view of geopolitics and the economic system with Bitcoin, and then trying to this thing is not going away. It seems to have some traction here. What does that really entail? And then try to play out the next 5, 10, 15 years. Okay, I think in terms of scenarios, right? Is there a scenario here where Bitcoin succeeds, and what does that look like, and what does that mean? And that was seemed like a very important question that I wanted to answer.
So there's a lot of cryptocurrencies, and we hear more and more about it in different channels and conversations, I'm sure, as well as a lot of stable coins. Why Bitcoin, right? What is it as you're going through analytical and your approach and everything? What is it about Bitcoin, and why would you suggest Bitcoin today?
Yeah, I mean, I don't give investment advice, right? But I think just an objective assessment, Bitcoin was the first, right? Bitcoin is the OG, right? Bitcoin was the breakthrough, right? It solved a very specific technical problem. Essentially, how do you have a form of digital cash that can't be double spent, right? It's just a digital ledger. How come you can't just copy paste the ledger entry and make more Bitcoin, right? And so it was this really unique synthesis of cryptography, taking advantage of features of public and private key encryption with a certain sort of clever algorithm for distributed consensus based off of proof of work, meaning you actually have to do physical work in the real world to add transactions to the blockchain, right? So there is no single intermediary that decides which transactions get processed. There's no single agent at the Fed or at a central bank that's deciding this is the supply of money. It's fixed by protocol, and it's distributed consensus that uses physical proof of work. And that was the critical sort of mix of things that had to be put together in kind of this genesis moment, kind of multiple decades of development in the distributed computing and the internet, cryptography, as well as some breakthrough ideas and how to distribute consensus. And that was sort of the spark, right? And that spark then catalyzed a whole bunch of copycats, right? We've had a proliferation of cryptocurrencies in the years since. There's been lots of innovations on different types of consensus mechanisms, different types of protocols. And like, we think Bitcoin is the most strategic and most important. We're not like dismissive of the relevance of any particular other cryptocurrency, but it seems clear to us at this point that Bitcoin is the most secure, the most neutral, the most decentralized, and the one that is, right now the market has decided, right? Like, you can have a priori views of what you think is going to be successful, and you have to see how the market actually reacts to your ideas. And the market has spoken, right? Bitcoin is about 65% of the total asset by market cap, and it's the one that all governments perceive as digital gold, right? There's no foundation that can change the protocol. There's no special group of insiders that got privileged access to the issuance. And so there's Bitcoin, essentially a digital commodity, and there's lots of other protocols that are essentially like digital equities, that are trying to do something different. And so there's use cases for lots of different types of blockchains, but we think Bitcoin is unique in its design, and it's clearly been sort of reified by market views over the last 15 years as a digital commodity. And then the regulatory environment has kind of solidified around that idea. And so this is kind of watching a novel synthetic commodity-like asset kind of monetize in real time in the internet era. And so at any given point, there's a lot of noise, like a lot of price speculation, as essentially the market collectively tries to assess, the probability of Bitcoin surviving like 50 years or going to zero. Right. And so given the sort of, it's pretty much like a bivalent distribution here of like, it completely fails, goes to zero, or it sticks around over, for the next 10, 20, 50, 100 plus years. And that becomes an asset in almost everyone's portfolio. So how you view the probabilities between those two options, can swing wildly. And so the early stages of Bitcoin is extremely risky. This is an open source software project. There was still like some bugs in the first few years. That took a while for people to view this as anything that could, survive, right? Government attack, right? There was all sorts of speculations about risks to Bitcoin. And it's sort of like the process of Lindy is the longer it lasts, the more it survives those attacks, the more people, sort of reflexively view it as this thing that will likely endure into the future. And that, is a positive feedback loop. So, yeah, I mean, we're the Bitcoin Policy Institute. We pay attention to the broader kind of collection of digital assets in the regulatory environment. But we think Bitcoin is unique in terms of its design. It's also unique in terms of its strategic implications.
Yeah, you touch on the institute, and that's where I wanted to go next. Give us the general framework for the Bitcoin Policy Institute. How long has it been around? How many are on your team with you? I'm sure there's no normal day, but what would a normal day look like for the work you all do?
Yes, it's certainly been a pretty rapid evolution since I first got started with it as their first fellow, essentially, in the depths of COVID, when they basically launched it as like a blog and started posting some, white papers, and then I would go to panels, et cetera. And so that was probably two and a half full-time staff for most of its history. We started accumulating a bench of fellows that were, they had full-time careers as other academics or professionals in economics, in the energy system, philosophers, national security folks like myself, technologists that would contribute to our research, that would be able to kind of support engagements with the Hill. And we did, a lot of work over the past few years to kind of establish our reputation as not an industry association. We're not here to lobby for a particular, set of industry, business models. We're here to sort of educate principally policymakers on what Bitcoin is and what it might represent and how it intersects with a whole swath of different policy domains. So the day-to-day of a think tank is kind of, you write white papers, you organize events, and then you have meetings, right, with relevant policymakers, and you try to answer their questions and try to shape, their ideas in a way that you think is informed by the facts and the right policy. And so we've grown dramatically in the last 6 months. We're now about 10 full-time staff. We have about 23 fellows. We do one major event every year, the Bitcoin Policy Summit. The next one will be in June, on June 25th. Each one is kind of doubled in size and impact from the last one. And we do some pop-up events, like we did a major event in March called Bitcoin for America. We bring sort of senior administration officials, politicians, industry officials, policy experts, and other folks from civil society, bring them together as like a serious group. And the sort of the event that put BPI on the map was our first policy summit at like in the depths of like the bear market after the FTX collapse. And it was everyone was like, crypto's dead. Sam Bankman-Fried basically spoiled the party, and it's all just rotten, full of scammers. And we decided, no, this is the time to actually go to double down. And so we organized an event, within like a month or two after that was focused on Bitcoin. And we were saying, no, Bitcoin is different than that, right? That was the crypto sort of scam, fiat nonsense, right? Bitcoin is real. Bitcoin is not that. And here's why. And we brought human rights activists, we brought national security professionals, we brought energy system experts, and we put them on stage with senators, with executive officials. Everyone is at the National Press Club wearing suits, right? It's not like a crypto conference where everyone's there, partying and, wearing, their orange, hats. It's like, this is a serious buttoned up DC think tank event. And that was the first of its kind. And I think it surprised a lot of politicians and the sort of the think tank sort of blog community that there's like, oh, there's something serious here, right? There's serious people talking about Bitcoin in a serious way. Like, we can engage with this, right? This is on our wavelength here. And so that was kind of the playbook that we've run and expanded on. And now we're doing a lot, right? Now we're helping kind of frame both the executive actions on things like Stretch Bitcoin Reserve, trying to put policy ideas on the table to make good on this sort of rhetorical commitment to be a pro-Bitcoin country, and then legislative analysis of Bitcoin-related bills, and then importantly, supporting the freedom aspects of this technology, right? So peer-to-peer rights, right? The ability to develop and transact peer-to-peer software. And we think that's like a critical mission. So we have a whole peer-to-peer rights fund that's a subsidiary that just is meant to basically support so essentially the legal defense of open source software developers. And so, yeah, I mean, Bitcoin is a leaderless community. There's industries attached to it, Bitcoin mining, Bitcoin custodians. It's now integrating into traditional finance. So there's a big business and set of businesses attached to Bitcoin. Bitcoin itself is an open source software protocol that's run around the world. And there's $2 trillion of value embedded in it. And so there's no one to speak for Bitcoin, right? There are, cryptocurrencies that have like a foundation that are like tokens issued by like an LLC or some corporate entity. And that entity has lobbyists. That entity has like government affairs people that speak on behalf and for it, right? We don't speak on behalf of Bitcoin, like no one can, but we are Bitcoiners who know about the technology, know about its intersection with our energy system, our national security, interests and the existing financial system. And we think that needs to be communicated effectively in a rigorous fashion to the government. And so that's been our bit. It's been going pretty well so far.
Yeah, I first encountered a couple of your colleagues, knew about BPI, but actually had an opportunity to meet with some of your colleagues at an Atlas Network event in Mexico City last year in August, and have been eager to have this kind of conversation since, because I saw the interaction that happened with Atlas Network partners from all over the world that were working on different projects and trying to think about how this could transform the way they ran their organizations or the conversations they were having with donors or leaders in their community or even governing officials about the future of society. So give us some advice that BPI usually has with partner organizations or individuals that you connect with about kind of getting started, the right questions to ask or the right way to think about Bitcoin and how it can really help them advance their objectives and their goals.
Yeah, so the way I first try to orient folks is just we are entering an age of disruption that's both geopolitical disruption as well as digital disruption. And so the basic frameworks, the mental models, the systems, institutions that most of us grew up in, that we felt as, were fixed as part of the firmament, that we would just sort of live within and those would continue to endure throughout our careers. That's not the case anymore, right? And I think the next few years in particular will be an era of accelerating disruptions where those sort of assumptions are going to have to be questioned. And so every organization that has a particular both mission as well as ethos is going to have to like adapt flexibly to an environment where like your assumptions are going to constantly be challenged. And Bitcoin is one of these ideas that is itself a disruption, right? It's an open source monetary network that anyone can plug into. So there's no gatekeepers. There's no one that you have to like, get approval from to use Bitcoin. That's kind of its, one of its core powers is that there is no gatekeeper for this system. And it connects anyone and everyone around the world. And so that's powerful for any organization to sort of plug into, right? As a way of essentially anchoring themselves to a new institution and a new network that is in the process of being adopted by others around the world. So there's power in connection. There's power in sort of attaching yourself to such a phenomenon, even as the other systems that we normally attach ourselves to become more and more uncertain, right? Or have more risk and instability start to be priced into them. So the first thing is just like understand Bitcoin, understand where it's evolving in the global environment, and it's now playing a geopolitical role right now. And you have the national leadership of the U.S. government saying Bitcoin is a digital gold and a strategic fixed supply asset. And you have the Middle East and China and Europe. Everyone is now, you can't ignore Bitcoin anymore, basically, right? And so you have to have a view of it. It could be positive or negative depending on where you stand, but you also have to think about how to use it, right? And there's Bitcoin as just money, right? And there's just Bitcoin as a fixed supply asset. You want to hold some of your treasury reserves in something that isn't going to get devalued or debased. Well, Bitcoin is a useful thing for that as a savings vehicle. But there's a lot of innovations happening on top of Bitcoin for cross-border payments, right? For really efficient sort of peer-to-peer settlements that use these like layer 2 initiatives like the Lightning Network and other sorts of privacy-preserving protocols. And so there's a lot of innovation happening on top of kind of the base layer of Bitcoin that lots of organizations that have a mission, say, in human rights or in international development or just entrepreneurship, right? They want to fund projects and they don't want to have to pay a whole bunch of like intermediaries a bunch of fees. There's lots of like innovations coming out of this sort of future of money, right? As a global project. And so, yeah, there's the technical piece of this, there's like the disruption piece of this, and there's the ideological piece of this, right? Bitcoin is freedom money. It's for people who want to take possession of their own money and not have to ask permission to use it. And that fundamentally view it as like a human right to do that. Right. And so this is, kind of standing on your own ground and saying, yeah, like, I think this is my Bitcoin. And I think I should have the right to send it to somebody without asking permission. And, money is essentially speech. Right. So I want to express my views. I want to associate freely with those who I have common cause with or want to support. This is the way I'm going to express that.
And it's to that effect, I think that there's quite a bit of alignment between BPI and the Atlas Network. And so I'm interested in the what attracted BPI to get involved with the Atlas Network and maybe what value the two organizations share together. We have a lot of partners that are on the program here and talk about how their organization has grown or benefited from the relationship. So I'm just interested in the same question for you. What does Atlas Network mean for BPI?
Yeah, I mean, we're small, we're scrappy, right? And so we want to amplify our impact by finding partners that are aligned in various ways and that can sort of amplify our impact, right? Like that's been the lesson of Bitcoin itself, is that it's a participatory kind of sum greater than the parts idea, and ultimately we want to empower civil society and individuals around the world to carve out a sphere of freedom in an era where the natural tendencies from technology disruption are going to be centralizing and geopolitical competition will be centralizing, right? Like the path we're on right now, like all else equal, is going to be a centralization of intelligence, right? Through these frontier AI models that are essentially going to be, a handful of major corporate oligopolies, centralization of money in the sense of a lot of countries in the world are pushing CBDCs, and centralization of state power as geopolitical conflict and competition accelerates, right? So the U.S., has it just as it's the evolution of these systems tends to go. When you're in a peer competitor, when you're in a peer competition, you tend to want to centralize power in order to win that competition. So there's a risk that we become more like China in order to beat China. And that may come at the expense of civil liberties. That might come at the expense of this vision of kind of classic liberal democracy that we've forged here. So I think, we're digital societies now, and so we need to look for digital technologies to reinforce this vision of a certain liberal order, not just in the United States, but around the world, where digital authoritarianism is on the march, and it's really efficient and effective to deploy and manage at scale. And there's a risk that once that is built out, that it's very hard to undo. And so we need to find what are sort of asymmetric tools in the toolbox here: Bitcoin, decentralized compute, other sorts of initiatives, as well as political mobilization, in order to like reinforce that vision. Given these sort of centralizing forces.
It's on that point, as I've mentioned, worldwide freedom movement several times. Do you find different partners around the globe or different conversations that you're having that are ahead of others? Is everyone kind of tracking at the same pace here? What does the worldwide movement look like for you?
It's a really interesting question. I would say, well, for example, like there's a gentleman named Roger Huang who wrote a book called "Would Mao Hold Bitcoin?" And it was like a history of China. It was a history of Bitcoin in China, and China has a really interesting history with Bitcoin. Bitcoin had a pretty broad uptake inside China in its early years. A lot of the Bitcoin mining companies were all Chinese companies, and they're forged this kind of subculture in China during kind of again, this is kind of before the Xi era kind of really took hold, and there was a lot of crackdowns. There was sort of this golden era between 2010, 2015-ish, where there was kind of a thriving Bitcoin subculture inside China. And there was a lot of like Chinese Bitcoiners that were minted there. And this idea that you could just, hold your own money in an internet, open, in an internet enabled way, kind of unlocked a lot of, people's minds, and sort of forged a kind of, a cohort there that never forgot that, even with the crackdowns. And so there's been kind of this, Bitcoin underground inside China for some time. And that was like an interesting test case of how, even in a digital authoritarian society like China, that's kind of become much more oppressive in the last few years. The kind of spark of freedom that the Bitcoin helped light is still surviving there. There's other kind of stories about human rights activists. The Human Rights Foundation, for example, is a partner organization of BPI. We have a really strong relationship with them, and they've done a lot of work with Bitcoin to help support dissidents and human rights activists in Afghanistan, in Russia, in Ukraine, in Iran, and other parts of the world. Because how do you pay or how do you support opposition where they're being debanked by the ruling party, or they're being tracked and surveilled on all the transactions? Essentially, give them away. And so how do you use Bitcoin to essentially keep opposition to autocrats supported? So we've seen that. But then on the policy front, just more recently, I was just at an event in England, and two gentlemen came up to us. I was with one of my colleagues at BPI, and they recognized us, or they came and specifically to meet us at this event, and they said, "Oh, we're starting the Norwegian Bitcoin Policy Institute," and they said we're basically inspired by you all. And these were like serious professionals. Like one of the individuals involved was like a senior politician, member of the advisory committees for the Sovereign Wealth Fund and the central bank. So he was like a defector, right, from the institutional kind of elite systems.
You probably see that a lot, right?
Yeah. So we see these like seeds, right? Like you go and you different kind of self-organized, bottom-up kind of approaches, and it's not, I'd say, fully mature, right? It's still very early days. There's no like sort of lot of coordination yet. I think that's kind of the track we're on. The next few years, I think there'll be a lot more of those sorts of organizations, and we start to kind of build peer-to-peer relationships. I think a lot good can come from that.
So you mentioned the Bitcoin Policy Summit in DC. You talked about the events that you all put on, and that this is a key one. So someone's listening or watching the podcast here, they hear about it, they go find out information, and they come. What can they expect? What's the experience like there?
Yeah, so this will be probably like our most important event to date. I say that, not just like to try to shill it, but all the forces and all like the trend lines are converging to make this kind of a hinge event in terms of decisively setting the agenda for U.S. Bitcoin policy, and by extension, because a lot of the world copies the U.S.'s moves, like the world's Bitcoin policy over the next few years. And so we're very focused on this not being just like a typical conference where you have panels and jibber jabber sessions and whatnot. Like, we'll have to have some of that, but we're really focused on having concrete policy presentations, right? Okay. The new administration has come into office. They've set this tone to be decisively pro-Bitcoin. They've signed an executive order establishing a strategic Bitcoin reserve. They've given instructions to Treasury Secretary Bessent, Commerce Secretary Lutnick to identify budget-neutral means of acquiring more Bitcoin with no marginal cost to the taxpayer, as well as to do an inventory of all the regulations that currently sort of infringe on self-custody or other sort of peer-to-peer rights. And so we want to like keep the pressure on, and we want to lay out like a firm vision of exactly what they can do tactically over the next 6, 12, 18, 24 months to move the ball forward on pro-Bitcoin policy. So we're going to have a lot of like tactical presentations on like policy suggestions, and we're going to have senior government officials there to react to those. And so this is not just like industry kind of getting together to like network to get business. This is about moving the policy conversation, ever further, right? Like the point of DPI since the beginning was to kind of change the Overton window here, right? The Overton window when we got started was Bitcoin's not a serious policy idea. Right, it's a den of drug money, cyber criminals, and North Korean, state, sort of money launderers, right? Like, there's no serious Bitcoin or let alone pro Bitcoin policy ideas. So we sort of, I think, we're successful at moving the Overton window out. So at least Bitcoin is a serious policy, topic that isn't just all negative, right? Now that the government, from the White House on down, has said we want to be pro Bitcoin, now the question is, well, what does that mean? Right? Like let's cash that check, right? Like, what does that actually look like from the standpoint of the CIA, from the standpoint of the Department of Defense, from the standpoint of the State Department, the Treasury Department, the Justice Department, the Department of Education, whatever remains. And then also, like, what does it mean for the states, right? The states themselves are now, adopting their own Bitcoin related policies. And then companies, right? Companies are adopting sort of Bitcoin treasury assets. And so this is like now playing out at all these different scales. A lot's happening really fast, right? A lot has changed. I think a lot of people have whiplash and don't really know how to sort of sort out the signal to noise here. So we want to like sort of press pause, assess where we are, assess like what the new regime is now, right? The government's saying that they're pro Bitcoin and establishing SPR, like that's changed things. Like folks were in Hong Kong, I was in Abu Dhabi. Like, there's big meetings happening in Riyadh this week. Like, Bitcoin is now on the table of discussion at those types of summits. And there are decisions that are going to be made pretty quickly that will have geopolitical impacts that we need to, be aware of and also help steer towards, the positive vision here we have for the technology. And so this is the event to kind of, bring everyone together and like make that happen. And then we're also going to have, all the networking. People can kind of find like-minded individuals that are interested in the intersection of Bitcoin with AI, Bitcoin with human rights, Bitcoin with national security, Bitcoin with the energy system, Bitcoin with the future of money and technology, Bitcoin and, blank, right? Whatever's coming next that we haven't thought of. So yeah, I think it should be a really fun time. And DC is kind of, we're trying to create like a Bitcoin node in DC. So we have a full-time office. We're going to be opening up an office in partnership with PubKey, which is this Manhattan Bitcoin bar. And so we're going to be opening up over the course of the summer essentially like they're going to have a bar and restaurant. We're going to have our offices and a shared event space. And so we're essentially going to be like a Bitcoin embassy, where the goal is to bring, DC to Bitcoin and Bitcoin to DC, and have like, cultural events, panel discussions, debates, roundtable discussions, and just, generally speaking, just kind of have like a third space that allows people to kind of, come into DC and have, casual gatherings and And that's where I think you have really good ideas flow.
Yeah, so Matt, so I can hear some of our audience right now. Sold. Like I'm in. How do I get involved with Bitcoin Policy Institute, right? How do I plug into an event? Where do I track you guys, find info, help others know how to engage with you all?
Yeah, we love support, right? We're both fundraising as well as we're looking for folks that have ideas to bring to the table. We don't have a monopoly on these good ideas, and we're always looking to assemble a roster of fellows. They can be like permanent fellows or just visiting fellows, where you might have just like one idea you just want to like write. It's been bubbling up in your brain. You're like, oh, I really think there's an interesting intersection between Bitcoin and my thing. And I want to write either a blog post or a white paper, or I want to record a podcast to talk about it. We want to be the venue to like vet and then amplify really interesting, innovative, cross-disciplinary, policy ideas that have Bitcoin in the intersection. So if that's your thing, you can reach out to me directly. I'm on Twitter at Matthew_Pines. You can hit my email address is pines@btcpolicy.org. Our website is btcpolicy.org. That's where we post all of our research. And yeah, I mean, we're also looking for folks just to attend our events and kind of get to know us. And so if you're in the DC area, we're going to be organizing, once we open up our office, we're going to be organizing like pretty frequent events, like at least like weekly happy hours and sort of monthly kind of events of some kind. So there's no pressure to kind of like have a take. You could just sort of show up. And we're looking for folks that are just beginning, but are curious and want to learn. So, there's an educational component of what we do is just answer the basic questions. And you'd be surprised, we have lots of meetings with staffers. The typical staffer is 25 years old and, they Wikipedia, Google, Bitcoin before the meeting. And there's still a lot of questions we get from like, what's the difference between Bitcoin and Fartcoin? Right? And it's like, oh, okay, well, let's start there. So we both happy to have that conversation, as well as, what is the relationship between Bitcoin, dollar-based stablecoins, and geopolitical competition between U.S. and China? So like we're trying to meet everyone where they are, we'd love to collaborate as much as we can.
Matt, we have just a little bit of time left here on the podcast, and I always like to ask our guests, because they're all leaders of different types all throughout the world. And you mentioned something before that caught my attention, where you said, you like to build teams and work with teams or whatever. So what is it that motivates Matt Pines, right? Like when you get up and you're building this organization, what's driving you?
Yeah, it's about really changing the world, right? And one thing that I've realized, it sounds a bit highfalutin, but I've seen it in real time, the last 6 months in particular, just being focused and having like aligned individuals that are motivated by like a higher purpose of some kind, right? Where they kind of get the bit, right? This isn't just like putting out a white paper to put out a white paper, right? Or like write a blog post or do a podcast. Like there's a vision here, and we think it's an achievable vision, even if it's absurdly ambitious, right? So you need to set somewhat ambitious goals for yourself and your team, and then just believe you can do it. And it turns out that a lot of people sort of self-limit or believe that it's not possible, or accept the status quo as, this sort of enduring constraint, this matrix that they're tied with. And we just sort of refuse to accept those constraints exist. And just like, you can just do things. That's basically been our mantra. We have it like written on the whiteboard for the past 6 months. Like, you can just do things. Like, do we think we can get X person to come to our event? Like, why not? Like, let's ask them, right? And then, oh, well, that person may actually now attend our event, and when people see who comes to our event in June, I think they might be surprised. So that's been kind of the really exciting feature of the last few months. The reason why I got involved with BPI full time is everyone there just is very much mission aligned and creative, and just like thinks that you could just do it, right? There's no, I'm going to ask the second level manager up for permission, and I have to then submit my case, or I have to go through some bureaucratic procedure. It's like, no, you have an idea. Okay, do the thing, right? And then we'll see what happens, and then we'll iterate from there, right?
So you're mentioning this ambition and drive and belief in what's possible, but there also has to be, for a team, belief in the leader, and seeing kind of this momentum and encouragement from the leader. And what I've sensed from you this whole conversation, there's this element of hope. Like there's not just a belief in it's the right way to go and something we should be talking about, but you actually see a future and an opportunity, and that you're leading everyone in that direction. What is it right now in a world that is destabilized, right? It is every day there's conflict, there's issues that are causing people to be more concerned about financial security and whatnot. Yet you're on the cutting edge with this kind of energy that everybody, it's palpable here, right? What is it that's giving you hope?
Well, I think in times of change, right, the aperture of possibility is much wider than in times of stasis, right? And so times of stasis, they can be stable, right? They're predictable, and if you're in a good position, right, sometimes you don't want things to change, right? But often that means that people are stuck, and they tend to be sort of listless, and it's hard to get motivation. When a society is stuck, it leads to pathologies and usually undermines the core structures and rots and decays and ultimately collapses. And so you have times of change. They're uncertain. They lead to disruption. There's anxiety associated with that. There's a sense of, okay, I can't predict the next week, month, year. And so there's always trade-offs here. But I think if you're coming out of a regime of somewhat stasis or lethargy, I think there is an energy associated with change. But you have to be, you have to approach it with the right attitude, right? If you're fearful or if you're, resistant or hesitant, you're likely going to get run over by that change, right? If you actually anticipate it, if you're leaning into it, you can, shape the change, right? The change isn't like this exogenous variable that just affects you, right? And it turns out human beings, like we're all just human beings. And even like national leaders, right? Like they're people that can be changed, right? People's brains are malleable objects. And it doesn't take like, it's not easy, but it's not like there's a winding clock that is just deterministically churning out our future here. And if you just find the right points of leverage, right? Like it's like the ship of state is a big cruise liner. You're like, how do I move this thing? Well, if you find out that you can get to the bridge and there's a little captain's chair there, and either you can get yourself in the captain's chair or just tell the captain, hey, just like nudge this a little bit to the right. You don't see that immediately, right? Everyone on the cruise ship probably doesn't even really notice. But a year, or a few days later, like the cruise ship is in a completely different direction, different part of the ocean, right? And so that's kind of the mental model that we have at BPI is, that's those little adjustments here that are like strategically, positioned, that we think in terms of the long-term course that's being adjusted. And that's much more like practical, because then you can, we don't need to change the whole cruise ship here. It's just, okay, how do we nudge the notch, right, a little bit further here?
So I'm sure if folks don't know about Matt Pines, if they don't know about Bitcoin Policy Institute, they're learning about you all. They will. They're going to hear you speak and come to one of your events in the future. So besides the work at BPI, what does Matt do when he's not in the office, right? What has your attention? What's the new hobby that is catching your attention, that just like Bitcoin did maybe half a decade to a decade ago?
Yeah, so I'm a suburban dad, so I've got 2 young daughters, 8 and 5. So that keeps me pretty well occupied in the non-working hours. I also have, a separate activity. I'm a senior advisor for a kind of a startup counter UAS company. So they are a bunch of military intelligence officials that have developed this interesting technology suite to do aerial surveillance. And so I'm advising them just kind of on the side, because they're also engaged in some exotic breakthrough initiatives that will have national policy implications, and that's kind of my thing. So I'm not a core technologist. I did some counter UAS work and technology assessment work in the past, and touched classified programs, and but I'm more there for like government affairs, strategic advisory, and their particular crossover sort of topic of interest is also of interest to national leadership in various ways on sort of the UAP topic. So that's where I have a certain insight. So I'm somehow like at the center of a lot of these interesting disruptions, Bitcoin, UAPs, and then I also am involved in some stuff on AI. That's not formal, but there's groups that are coming into DC, again, like they see these accelerating disruptions coming, for example, artificial general intelligence, and they're trying to like come into the staffers and try to explain to them, like, you don't know it's coming, right? And I'm like, oh, this was us like 3 or 4 years ago with Bitcoin. We're like, we're like, there's a storm coming, right? And you're not prepared for it. Like, you need to get educated, and here's like a serious kind of thoughtful way to think about this, disruption that's on the horizon. And the AI thing is the thing that's just around the corner. And so there's a lot of groups kind of pouring into DC, trying to do like the same sort of thing that we were doing. And so we're, trying to collaborate with them. And there's a lot of intersections, practically between these topics, on the energy system and the geopolitical competition. So I'm like, my like overall approach is like accelerating disruptions, monetary disruptions, technological disruptions, other social geopolitical disruptions, coming from these different, domains that are all going to converge the next few years. That keeps me pretty well occupied.
So you mentioned something there at the end, and I want to end with last question here, if I could. You talked about now helping advise some of these other organizations coming in and kind of helping partner with them because of your own experience. So many Atlas Network partners are startup organizations, or they're still small teams that are punching above their weight, right? So if you're at one of the Atlas Network events that goes on around the world and you bump into a peer partner and kind of sharing stories, what advice would you give them about walking this path that you're walking with your team right now?
Yeah, it's hard to say. I would say the most important thing was like not to get trapped in a certain model of what you are, right? Like BPI constantly reinvented itself like almost every 6 to 9 months, and constantly acted as if it was already at that next level, right? And sort of presented itself in all of our interactions. Like, people didn't know that for most of our time, we were basically 2.5 full-time people, right? Like, sort of constantly trying to, spin lots of different plates. So you have to kind of balance, obviously not biting off too much that you can't chew, but you always stretching further, right? And always trying to do something that probably not in your comfort zone, right? Because if you're, just want like a lifestyle, think tank, we could have been a lifestyle think tank, coast on like 1 or 2 nice donors' money, churn out white papers, do an event every year, and just kind of become this self-licking ice cream cone, steady she goes. And that's fine. Like, that's a sustainable thing. Like, people can do that. But I don't know, that wasn't attractive to me. Like, ideally for me, like, BPI should either not exist in 5 years or like be a fundamentally different thing, right? In my view, like, if we're successful, like the sorts of things we're talking about and advocating for now will not be relevant in 3 to 4 years, right? And so either there's a whole bunch of new issues there that we still need to exist to support, or we're going to fundamentally adapt and change as an organization. So that's like built into my DNA, or the DNA of the organization is BPI today. BPI in 12 months, in 24 months could be something radically different. It's like whatever the team collectively feels that we can have the most impact that's aligned with our objectives, we're just going to do that thing. And not going to be trapped in, oh, well, our strategic plan from 12 months ago said this is the yada, yada, yada that we have to execute here. So there's a tension between planning and deliberate, organized action, without, constraining yourself, because it's all about optionality, especially when you're in a policy space that's changing quite dramatically. You need to have that optionality and that flexibility to say, drop what we're doing this thing now, right? Because this is the high leverage thing that we can do right now. And that thing we thought we were supposed to be doing, that can wait 6 months. Like, this is the moment we need to like go all in. And we've done that a few times, and it's been the key to our success, is just knowing when to kind of drop everything else and just go all in on something. And it's risky. I mean, we spent like early in our history, when I was just an advisor, there were moments where we basically just decided we've got like a few months of runway left. We can kind of like, Hail Mary, and like an event, or just kind of like die slowly. And we're like, all right, pull forward. We're going to spend it all in one big event. If it works, maybe that gives us a new lease on life. If not, we go out with a bang. And it worked. So like, if you're not taking risk, even as a nonprofit or a small org, like, you're probably missing out.
Well, I want to thank Matt Pines with BPI for being our guest today on Atlas Network. I want to thank you for listening and encourage you to go to atlasnetwork.org, where you can get information on BPI and all the other partners within Atlas Network and find out how you can become involved in the worldwide freedom movement. Until next time, onward.